Hi everybody, my name is Drake Asbury and I'm going to be presenting on the effects of bilingual voice onset timings in different language modes today. So I think it's a good idea to start with a little bit of terminology. First, voice onset time is abbreviated as VOT, commonly written this way in research, and it's usually measured in milliseconds. So we have voice onset timings, mainly concerning initial plosives, and they're measured different ways depending on whether they're voiced or voiceless and on language context as well. Pre-voiced is the term used to describe a negative VOT, and this occurs when the voicing begins before the actual release of a stop, as in a Spanish mba. Short lag, this describes a positive VOT value, as does long lag. The difference between short lag and long lag is typically realized in the form of aspiration. So to use Spanish and English as an example, which will be a common example throughout this presentation, we actually see that there's some overlap between these categories. So for example, short lag is used to produce a Spanish p, but a short lag VOT is used to produce an English b, causing some confusion. Compared with long lag VOT of the English p, where you can hear the breath of air that comes out after the plosive. Some other terms that we need to be familiar with are language switching and code switching. Up to this point, the research has been pretty vague with this until the last couple of years, and it's caused probably some of the mixed results that you're going to see later in the presentation. But for our purposes today, we're going to define language switching as a time when speakers switch languages between the first utterance and the second utterance. So there's a pause in between switching from one language to another. However, on the other hand, code switching is when a speaker is switching languages during the same utterance without pause. So kind of think of it as a sentence level. If the language says one sentence, if the speaker says one sentence in a language, and then in the following sentence switches to the other language, then we're going to define that as language switching. However, if the speaker is saying something in one sentence and without pause, and in the same sentence switches to the second language, then we're going to define that as code switching. So now that we have some of the basic terminology down, it's best to look at some of the theoretical frameworks that's commonly referenced in this type of research. The first is the speech learning model, also known as SLM. It was first proposed by Flagey in 1995, and it claims that L2 phonemes that are dissimilar from those found in the L1 inventory are likely to be less difficult to produce by the L2 learner, while the opposite is also true. The closer two phonemes are in acoustic properties, the more difficulty a learner will have in acquiring the L2 phoneme. Basically what this says is that if a sound in one language is acoustically similar to a sound in the learner's L1 inventory, then they're going to have a hard time noticing the difference and therefore will assimilate this into the sounds of their L1, noting that there's no need to make a change here or a distinction in this particular thing. So therefore, the opposite is also true. The more distant a sound is, or the more different a sound is in the L2 from the L1, is likely to make the learner notice this difference and therefore be able to produce it with less difficulty by creating a new sound category in their phonological space that allows them to produce this dissimilar L2 sound. The other framework that's very important for this particular research looking at VOT and language modes is the language mode framework. So in a lot of research, bilinguals were thought to basically be two monolinguals that happen to be stored in one person. So it explains the representation here as a way of being on a continuum, so that a bilingual is not really two monolingual speakers in one brain, but they do have two languages stored in one brain, but it's more of a continuum. So it goes from being a monolingual to a bilingual. And depending on the context of which the speaker finds themselves in, they'll be somewhere along this continuum. So a monolingual context, for example, would be when a bilingual is speaking with a group of monolingual speakers, or a group of bilingual speakers that don't speak the same two languages. This makes sense because if they spoke in a language that is not understood by their audience, they're not going to be able to communicate their ideas. Bilingual mode is when a bilingual finds themselves speaking in a group of bilinguals who share two or more common languages, in which case understanding or communication breakdown is not going to occur from a language shift. So with these things in mind, this is the research questions that I came up with at the beginning of this literature review process, and hopefully we'll have somewhat of an answer by the end of the presentation on the preliminary findings that have come to so far. So the first research question is, how can VOT inform research about the way bilinguals process, store, and produce multiple languages? So we know that the bilingual is storing two or more languages in their brain, and along with languages they have lexical space, phonological space, a multitude of processes that are going on. And VOT has become a variable of speech that we can look at for beginning oral stops such as ba, ba, ta, da, ka, ga, as a way to quantify this and hopefully lead to some understanding of what is actually happening in a bilingual's brain. So the second question is, does the language mode of a bilingual affect the way they produce VOT values? So we'll be looking at several different modes, monolingual and bilingual, as defined earlier in the context in which they look at, and as you'll see shortly, we're actually going to break bilingual down into a couple different areas. And the last one is, what direction are VOT values of a bilingual affected? So in terms of direction, what we mean is we want to know if the L1 is affecting the VOT values of the L2, if the L2 is affecting the VOT values of the L1, if there's a simultaneous effect where both the L1 and the L2 are affecting the other respective language, or lastly, if there's no effect whatsoever. So with these in mind, we will get into language modes, and we'll define them one more time very quickly. So we have monolingual mode, and in monolingual mode, the bilingual is suppressing one of the two languages. This can happen for multiple reasons, such as explained earlier. If a bilingual is speaking with a group of monolingual speakers, it's not productive for them to switch languages because communication will not occur. The ideas are going to be lost because the interlocutors are not going to understand the information being conveyed in the second language that they don't understand. Second, we have bilingual mode, and we're going to look at this from a language switching standpoint, following the definitions that were given earlier. So in this mode, a bilingual is thought to have both languages activated, but to be more specific for this literature review and in terms of future research, we're going to separate this by speech X. So again, language switching is when there's a pause between the language switch, and it doesn't have to be a very long pause, but very short pause. So again, think of it on the sentence level. So if the bilingual is saying something in a sentence and the entire sentence is in one language, and then the following sentence is in a different language, we're going to consider that language switching. The one that we're really concerned with, and research as well is becoming more and more concerned with, is the bilingual mode where code switching occurs. And again, this is where the bilingual uses both languages in the single utterance. So both languages are clearly activated in order for them to be able to produce two different languages within a single utterance without a pause. So now I want to turn to a few studies that have investigated VOT in a monolingual mode. The seminal work was first done by Lisker and Abrams in 1964, who conducted a multi-language study of VOT for initial stops. It basically has been the work that is referenced now to show that VOT happens along a continuum and that different languages have different breaking points to distinguish between the stops of each respective language based on a VOT value that falls somewhere in this continuum from pre-voiced VOT values to long lag VOT values. Second study here is Antonio et al. 2010, and he used Greek-English bilinguals. They were L2 dominant English speakers living in Australia but had learned Greek from birth. Greek is actually their L1. And he found that they were actually able to produce initial stops with VOT values similar to Greek and English monolinguals in their respective monolingual modes. Lopez, 2012, used English-Spanish bilinguals who produced voiceless VOT initial stops differently in monolingual mode. The VOT values are different than the Spanish and monolinguals, as referenced back to Lisker and Abrams in 1964. However, we're going to see more about this study because the main goal of her study was to use VOT to determine if code switching is affecting their VOT values, and the monolingual values that she recorded were simply used as controls in her study. And finally, McGlure and Green, 1999, also used Spanish-English bilinguals, and they were recorded on different days. So I think this gives reason to believe that these are true monolingual modes for these Spanish-English bilinguals as opposed to a language switching task. Now moving on to some bilingual mode with language switching task. Two studies that exemplify this, I believe, are Sancier and Fowler, 1997. The participant in this study shifts VOT values depending on whether she's speaking Portuguese or English, which is her dominant L2. She grew up in Brazil and was an adult learner of English as an L2, but has become her dominant language because she lives now in the US. What they did is they measured her VOT values before going to Brazil and noticed that she had very much English-like VOT values, and after speaking Portuguese, her VOT values shifted towards shorter VOT values found in Portuguese. Another study that also looks at language switching is Olson, 2013, and his basic level of VOT use here is to investigate whether language dominance had any effect on VOT values when switching between languages. And finally, we're going to look at a couple of studies that exemplify code switching in the bilingual mode. As you can see, many of these studies are very recent as the trend is going towards code switching and figuring out what code switching can tell us about VOT and bilinguals and how they're using that. So the first one is from 1994, Grosjean and Miller. They used French-English bilingual sentences that contain code-switching utterances with names of the opposite language. So they compared these results from this code-switching task to the monolingual story readings in English and French by the same participants. Basically, they were instructed to say the names, whether they were French or English, and the French or English pronunciation, and they were inserted into sentences. And the names all started with pa, tus, and cuz, because that's the initial stops that they were concerned with in this study. The next study is actually a follow-up study from their own 2010 publication. So they revisited the Greek-English bilingual participants in a code-switching task. So they were actually the same participants from the monolingual task that was performed in the study from 2010, and they were brought back. The participants first recorded the monolingual modes opposite of the ones that they had been recording in the 2010 paper. So the participants had been split into two groups, randomly assigned, half to the Greek monolingual group and half to the English monolingual group. And so therefore, in the 2011 paper, they came back, and the people that had been assigned to the Greek monolingual mode the first time were given the task of the English monolingual mode and vice versa. Then they did a code switching task working with pa, ta, ba, and da, in which they inserted into the same utterance the sound. However, the orthography was represented in the two different respective languages. So there would be a carrier sentence that would be written in English with the token sound written in the Greek, and the opposite as well. So this is how they were going about finding out code switching, so keeping it within the same utterance. The Lopez 2012 study, as already mentioned, had a monolingual collection of VOT data that they used as controls in comparing the same monolingual VOT values that were given in monolingual mode to sentences that were done with code switching included in them, and that was the big basis of their study here. Actually having 216 different tokens that were collected here. So the next study, the Balukas and Coops 2015, actually used corpus data of recordings in New Mexico where Spanish and English code switching is common. So they investigate VOT as a correlate of time since code switch. So they broke down their measurement periods into a pre-switch value, a value right at the language switch, and a post-switch. And they were looking to see at basically how long does it take for the effects to disappear if there are effects of code switching involved in these bilinguals. And the latest study here is the Panini and Arvinanti recorded Spanish-English bilinguals in a free speech session where only the topics of discussion were given as guidance. So they were given a topic and they were told to discuss it amongst one another, and the participants were actually familiar with one another as a result of previous research stating that bilinguals typically will not code switch unless they are already familiar with the person and know that they understand both of the languages. So not knowing this would have been a hindrance to the study, as they would have not been able to collect the data that they needed in order to see if code switching was affecting the VOT values that they produced. So now we're going to move on to directionality of effect. So here again you can see what we've already defined. So we have three different possible main effects, which is unidirectional. The effects of VOT values are asymmetrical. Either the L1 attracts or repels the VOT values of L2 while the L1 remains unaffected, or the L2 attracts or repels the VOT values of L1 while the L2 remains unaffected. The bidirectional effect is when the L1 and the L2 values are affected by one another. And the last one is the no effect, where neither L1 or L2 values are affected by each other. So a couple of studies that found unidirectional processes going on with the VOT values are the Antonian et al. 2011 study. They found that code switching bilinguals mode, the bilinguals VOT values of English became shorter than in the monolingual context. However, the same pattern was not found in the Greek VOT values. And if you remember, the Greek was their L1, so this would have been an L1 affecting the L2 values, even though they were dominant L2 speakers. So the Balukas and Coops 2015 study was also in code switching bilingual mode. The English VOT values that they found for initial voiceless stops became shorter than the monolingual norms, while the Spanish VOT values were unaffected by the code switching and remained within the range of monolingual Spanish norms. Also in 2013, found similar results to Balukas and Coops 2015, whereas the Spanish-English bilinguals had VOT values that shifted towards the non-dominant language during code switching. So a couple of the bidirectional is the Sancerre and Fowler 1997. Remember that the L1 Portuguese speaker and late learner of English shifted her VOT values depending on the language context in which she was speaking. So they had measured VOT values before and after trips to Brazil and found a shift. Also in 2013 also found the bidirectional effect of VOT values when they compared both groups, the English dominant group and the Spanish dominant group. So the English dominant bilinguals and the switch tokens of their study shifted towards Spanish like VOTs, which were shorter, and the Spanish dominant bilinguals in the same context similarly shifted towards longer English like VOTs. Finally, we come to the no effect. Several studies, Gurdoshan and Miller 1994 found no effect of code switching in either language. Suggested that bilinguals can switch from one language to another instantaneously without any processing cost. McGlure and Green 1999 had recorded Spanish-English bilinguals, English monolinguals, and Spanish monolinguals at different speech rates. They found that the Spanish-English bilinguals can function as monolinguals of both languages in terms of VOT stop consonants. Antonio et al. 2010 similarly found in a language switching experiment design Greek-English bilinguals can produce Greek VOT values when in Greek monolingual mode or within Greek monolingual norms, and they showed a similar pattern for English. So the preliminary conclusions are as follows. For research question 1, it appears that no clear-cut answer has been discovered at this point. Therefore, continued research in the area of VOT changes in bilinguals is necessary. However, to respond to the first research question, VOT is telling us something about the interactions of the language, storage, and processing in the bilingual mind. Therefore, it makes it important for the continuation of this type of research. Research questions 2 and 3, there are studies that support all three hypotheses. However, mounting evidence supports the idea of language modes affecting VOT production as far as direction is concerned. However, many variables need to be accounted for in these types of studies, suggesting that careful planning for future studies is necessary to disentangle the differing weights of these independent learner variables. And as the studies have progressed through time, you can see that these are getting more and more restrictive in an attempt to control for these types of learner variables that may be affecting the overall results, causing the inconsistent results. The conflicting evidence in the research suggests more information is needed. Perhaps a new method of eliciting specific types of information is in order, and while VOT is clearly related to second language acquisition at this point, conclusions remain unclear. As a result, no tangible direct implication can be made to second language classrooms at this point. However, it is important for educators to understand the general findings in order to recognize why their second language learners may be having difficulty understanding or producing initial stops in the L2.